Welcome back to my channel. In my last video, we looked at the claim that prophecies in the Hebrew scriptures were fulfilled by Jesus in the New Testament. Along the way, we examined the gospel accounts of Jesus' birth, his ministry, his death, and his alleged resurrection. And I noted some places where the various gospel writers told the stories differently. But these differences, or contradictions, were not the main focus of the video. Today, we'll take a closer look at the resurrection stories in the four Gospels and try to discover to what extent these stories form a single, coherent, consistent narrative. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on the Gospels. If you just want to see the comparison of the resurrection stories, feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter. What are the Gospels? These are ancient biographies of Jesus written down some 40, 50, or 60 years after Christ's death. The manuscripts themselves don't say who the authors were, and none of them purports to be an eyewitness account. About 100 years after they were written, the church starts referring to them as the Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And church tradition makes some claims about who these people were. But since the authors don't identify themselves in the text of the Gospels, it's conventional within New Testament scholarship to say these books were written anonymously. For convenience, I will refer to the four Gospels by their traditional titles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, regardless of who actually wrote them. Most scholars hold the Gospel of Mark to be the earliest, appearing sometime around 70 CE. About 40 years after Jesus died. Church tradition holds that this gospel was written by John Mark, a companion of the Apostle Peter, who is mentioned in the book of Acts. If that's true, then this gospel would not be an eyewitness account, but it would be the next best thing. If Mark was writing down stories he got directly from Peter, his gospel would be a second-hand account, as opposed to third-hand, fourth-hand, and so on. Remember, though, the book itself doesn't say it was written by Mark or by a companion of Peter. That's a claim the church starts making in the middle of the 2nd century. Luke and Matthew are really interesting documents because both of these include most of Mark's text word for word, and then they make a bunch of edits. Some things are deleted, some things are changed, and a whole bunch of other stuff is added. Some of this additional material is the same in Luke and Matthew, and then there's some material that's unique to Matthew and some that's unique to Luke. So these two Gospels are really compilations. They're Mark plus some other stories from oral tradition or from other documents that Mark didn't include. Luke's Gospel is actually the first part of a 2-volume work, the second part being the Acts of the Apostles, an account of the early church in the period immediately following Christ's death and resurrection. Tradition holds that Luke was a sometime companion of the Apostle Paul, but again, there's no solid evidence for these traditional attributions. The Gospel of Luke begins by saying, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you." In other words, at the time this gospel was written, there were already many different versions of the story floating around. The author says he's trying to write an orderly account. That is, he's taking stories from Mark and stories from some other places and trying to put it all together. The Gospel of Matthew appears to be the same kind of thing. It includes 90% of Mark, word for word, with some sections taken out or altered, and a bunch of additional stories are added in. Church tradition claims that this gospel was written by an eyewitness, one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus. But the majority of New Testament scholars do not find this claim plausible. First of all, as I mentioned, the gospel itself makes no such claim. It's written in the third person. Jesus did this, the disciples did that. In the parts where the disciple Matthew appears as a character, he's described in the third person. Jesus saw a man named Matthew. Matthew got up and followed him. It doesn't say Jesus saw me. I got up and followed him. There's no suggestion that the writer actually participated in these events. Second of all, if a disciple of Jesus were writing down his own personal experiences, why would he start by copying down the exact words of somebody else's book and then just add some bonus material? This isn't anybody's unique perspective. It's an edited compilation of various stories, and there's no reason to believe an eyewitness had anything to do with it. These first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. Because they have so many elements in common, it's easy to place them side by side and compare and contrast, to examine them synoptically. Needless to say, there's a ton of scholarship on the Gospels and how they're related to one another. I'm just giving a basic summary. Finally, there's the Gospel of John, which is generally considered to be the last one written, appearing maybe around the year 90, about 60 years after the events it narrates. Now, when we examine the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, we can see that some of the material came from Mark and some of it came from somewhere else. That helps us identify the different pieces that were stitched together, and scholars can come up with theories about which part came first, which parts came later, and how many authors may have been involved. The Gospel of John is not based on Mark, so we have even less of an idea of where this narrative came from, how many authors there were, or what sources they used. This gospel is traditionally attributed to the Apostle John. Like the others, this gospel doesn't actually identify its author, but it does say in chapter 21, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true." That verse is pretty confusing, because on one hand it says one of the disciples, presumably John, testified to what's in the book. But on the other hand, it says, "We know that his testimony is true." So there's someone else who's writing this account, whoever's speaking when it says, "We know it's true." If anything, that suggests that someone else, not John, wrote this version of the events, and the writer believes, or wants you to believe, that they're passing along eyewitness testimony. But did they get their information directly from John? Or did they hear it from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone who said they talked to John? Remember that this gospel first appears around 90 CE, 60 years after the events. So even if we assume that the stories were based on eyewitness testimony, they still had 60 years to grow and develop and change. Also, keep in mind that all four Gospels are written in Greek, but the disciples of Jesus would have been Aramaic-speaking Jews. The Apostle John was supposed to be an uneducated fisherman. In a world where 90+% of the population was illiterate, it's unlikely he would have been able to write even in his own native language, let alone write in Greek. So there's no plausible scenario where the Apostle John himself writes the Greek text found in the New Testament. The best case is that John said something that was written down, passed along over the decades, and translated into Greek, so that the gospel still contains some of his testimony. But that's just a hope. There's no real evidence. In summary, believers in church tradition will tell you that Matthew and John are eyewitness accounts, and Mark and Luke are secondhand accounts based on eyewitness testimony. The majority of scholars, on the other hand, take these to be anonymous writings based on half a century of oral tradition, far removed from the events they narrate. We can return to this question later when we've taken a closer look at the stories themselves. Now, let's dive in. All four resurrection accounts start with Mary Magdalene visiting the tomb of Jesus on the Sunday after the crucifixion. The Gospel of John mentions only Mary, giving the impression that she visits the tomb alone. Matthew mentions 2 women, Mark mentions 3, and Luke suggests there were more than 3. This is often cited as an internal inconsistency in the Gospels. In my last video, I included it on a list of potential contradictions. However, it should be clear that this type of difference is very easy to reconcile. If we start with the assumption that all 4 Gospels are correct, the obvious conclusion is that Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and Joanna went to the tomb, and each Gospel gave a partial account. John only mentions Mary, but he doesn't actually say Mary went alone. So you could make a case that Mary went with 3 or more other women, and John just didn't mention that part because he didn't know, or he didn't think it was important, or for some other reason. This kind of thing happens all the time in life. If 4 people went to a party, and afterward you asked each of them who was there, you'd get 4 different lists. Each person would notice different things based on where they were standing and what they think is important. On the other hand, either it matters which women went to the tomb, or it doesn't. If it doesn't matter, why are the gospel writers telling us in the first place? Presumably, it does matter, because we're being told who witnessed the empty tomb. If you read John's account without reading the others, you would get the impression that all the other followers have fled, and Mary goes to the tomb alone. Mark and Luke give a very different impression. So, even though the accounts can be harmonized, the individual Gospels paint different pictures of that moment where Mary goes to the tomb. There's also a potential contradiction regarding the time of day the women visited the tomb. John says it was still dark, Matthew says it was dawn, and Mark says it was after sunrise. I don't see a big problem here. All 4 Gospels agree it was in the early hours of the morning, right around sunrise. If we say they set out when it was still dark, and then the sun came up and they arrived when it was light, the stories are in harmony and there's no real contradiction. The 4 Gospels agree that the body of Jesus was buried in a cave, and the cave entrance was blocked off by a large stone. Note that there's no extra-biblical evidence for this. Crucifixion victims were typically left unburied or tossed in a mass grave. But this is the gospel story. So our next question is, when and how was the stone removed so the women would have access to Jesus' tomb? Mark, Luke, and John agree that the stone was already removed before the women arrived. The Gospel of Matthew makes an entirely different claim. Here, the women witness the stone being rolled away by an angel who causes a violent earthquake. We know this is supposed to be happening in the presence of the women, because the angel addresses them. So, which is it? Was the stone removed before the women arrived? Or was it moved by an angel while the women were watching? As far as I can tell, these accounts are in direct contradiction and irreconcilable. Could we say that some of the women saw the stone rolled away by an angel, and then others arrived after the stone was moved? Not really, because Mary Magdalene is included in every account. Why would Mary be surprised to find that the stone had been removed, as in Mark, if she herself had witnessed an angel doing it in Matthew? It seems clear to me that Matthew is embellishing here, adding mythological elements to make the story more dramatic and impressive. The angel of the Lord, a violent earthquake. This is something Matthew does. He also adds an earthquake to the crucifixion story, saying that when Jesus died, the earth shook, the rocks split, the tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. These events, if they occurred, would be spectacular miracles, and there would presumably be dozens of eyewitnesses who saw the resurrected saints walking around Jerusalem. Instead, Matthew is the only source that even mentions them. It seems to me a fair inference that these stories were not a part of the original narrative, that they're found only in Matthew because they were late additions. But set that aside. Whether or not Matthew's story is a fictitious embellishment, the point is that the stories can't both be true. Either the stone was removed before the women arrived, or it was removed afterward, or none of this happened at all. Matthew also adds another detail here. He says that the angel's entrance was so dramatic and frightening that the guards shook and became like dead men. Wait a minute. There were guards? Yes. Of the 4 gospel writers, Matthew alone puts guards in front of the tomb. He adds a whole story about the Jewish priests going to Pontius Pilate and telling him to guard the tomb. After the resurrection, Matthew has the guards going back to the priests and telling them what happened, and the priests pay them to go around saying that Jesus' body was stolen. Matthew notes that this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. So many problems with this story. First of all, again, it contradicts the other gospel accounts. In the other gospels, the cave entrance is wide open and unguarded, and the women can walk right in. That's totally different from Matthew's claim that an angel came and knocked out the guards. I don't think you can say, well, in the other gospels the guards were there, but the writer just didn't mention them. This is not an insignificant detail. If the tomb was guarded, you would mention it. Second, who's supposed to be the source for this information about Pilate and the chief priests? When the Gospels tell us what Jesus and the disciples were doing, the reader is supposed to assume that the disciples were there and they can verify these facts. But how would Matthew know about private conversations between Pontius Pilate and the Jewish priests, or between the priests and Pilate's guards? It's not logical. Of course, you can come up with explanations after the fact and say that one of the Pharisees was acting as a double agent and he went and reported back to the disciples. But Matthew doesn't even claim this. You have to come up with your own theories to make it make sense. And third of all, this really looks like the author is trying to address people's concerns about the resurrection story. Remember, this gospel was most probably written 50 years after the events. So people have been telling the story of Jesus' resurrection for 50 years, and presumably people have been raising some obvious questions, like how do we know the body wasn't stolen? The author of Matthew answers the objection by saying, well, the tomb was guarded, and the Jews paid the guards to say the body was stolen. But the very fact that he's introducing these new details in response to critics' arguments suggests that these details are made up. Next, the Gospels give 4 different accounts of who greeted the women at the tomb. Mark says there was a young man, Luke says 2 men, Matthew says there was an angel, and John says 2 angels. Now, I'm not so concerned about the numbers. As some apologists have pointed out, if you've got 2, then you've also got 1. When you see 2 angels, it is technically true to say you saw an angel, although that's a pretty weird way of saying it. And I'm not worried about the fact that they're sometimes referred to as men and sometimes as angels. Maybe the gospel writers weren't sure if they were angels or not, so they just reported what they knew. But if it happened like it did in Matthew with an angel descending from the sky with a violent earthquake, you'd know. And that's the part that's problematic. Not the number of angels or the description of them, but the fact that these are 4 different narratives about how they appeared and what they did and said. In Matthew, the women are still standing outside the tomb when an angel appears. In Mark and Luke, they encounter angels after they enter the tomb or as they enter. In Mark, a young man is sitting down, and in Luke, 2 angels are standing. In John, the angels are inside the tomb, but Mary is outside looking in. And perhaps most importantly, in John this happens later in the story, after Mary already went and told the disciples that the tomb was empty. In the other Gospels, Mary sees an angel first, but in John, she talks to the disciples first. It's an entirely different story. These can't be harmonized like the lists of women going to visit the tomb. For all of these stories to be true, Mary would have to see an angel outside the tomb, then go inside and see 1 angel sitting down and 2 standing up. Then she goes and tells the disciples, and then she sees another 2 angels when she returns, a total of 6 angels. But that's not consistent either, because again, in John, Mary speaks to the disciples before she sees any angels. In the other 3, she sees the angels first. These are contradictory accounts. Next, in Mark and Matthew, the angel, singular, tells the women they're going to meet up with Jesus in Galilee. The text of these 2 passages is almost identical. This is a case where Matthew copies Mark almost word for word and does some light editing. That's very common in Matthew. In Luke and John, there is no instruction to go to Galilee. In Luke, the angels tell the women he has risen, and they go and tell the disciples without receiving any further instructions. In John, the angels just ask Mary why she's crying. Then Jesus appears, and he gives Mary a message to tell the disciples. Go to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to God. So in Mark and Matthew, it's explicitly stated that the disciples will meet up with Jesus in Galilee. In Luke and John, there is no such plan. This will make a difference later on. For now, let me just say this. To someone who's not familiar with the area, Galilee and Jerusalem may sound equally foreign, and it may not be clear how they're different. But Jerusalem is the city dominated by the priests and Pharisees who are portrayed in the Gospels as Jesus' enemies. It's where Jesus was crucified and where the disciples are currently staying. Galilee is up north in the country, where Jesus and his disciples come from, and it's 100 miles away, maybe 5 days' journey. So it makes a difference whether or not the disciples are told to make this journey. In the next part of the story, the women are supposed to tell the disciples what they saw at the tomb. In Mark, it actually says they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The oldest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark end here. They were afraid, the end. Now, there are different theories about this. Some people think the author intentionally ended it that way. He wanted to end mysteriously, with the women wondering what to do, so you have to sort of figure it out for yourself. Personally, I don't find that convincing. It seems more likely to me that the original ending was removed, deleted, or somehow lost. If you go to your Bible, you'll find there are two other possible endings for Mark, the so-called long and short endings. But we know these were tacked on significantly later, in the 2nd century. The other 3 Gospels have the women going and telling the disciples what happened. In Matthew, the women are on their way to tell them when Jesus himself appears to them. He tells them again that the disciples need to meet up with him in Galilee. The disciples apparently get the message and believe it, because the next time we see them, they've made the journey. In Luke, it says the disciples didn't believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. As I've said, the Gospel of Mark got a new ending in the 2nd century. This doesn't count for much because it was written so much later. But for what it's worth, the long ending of Mark echoes Luke's claim that the women were not believed. Both Luke and John have the disciples inspect the empty tomb. Luke says it was just Peter. John says it was Peter and another disciple. Either way, the disciples go back to where they were staying, in Jerusalem. They are never told to go to Galilee. Some people claim that the original ending of Mark contradicts the other 3 by saying the women didn't tell anybody. I wouldn't count that as a contradiction because I don't think that was ever supposed to be the ending. It's possible that the original text had the women telling the disciples just as the other Gospels do. But in Matthew, the women relay a message that the men are supposed to go to Galilee, and they believe them. They go. In Luke, the women are not believed. In John, it doesn't say whether the disciples believe Mary, but they don't go to Galilee. They stay where they are, in Jerusalem. Now let's look at the resurrection appearances. In Matthew and John, and the long version of Mark, Jesus appears to the women. No such thing happens in Luke. I consider this to be a contradiction. I know you can say that Luke just doesn't mention that particular detail, but for me that's a problem. If Mary Magdalene witnessed the resurrected Lord on Easter Sunday, that's not just a detail. Surely it's the most important part of the story. Luke does not include a scene in which the women see Jesus, thus I think it's fair to say that in his story, they don't see him. This is the point where Jesus starts appearing to the men, the disciples. In Luke, he appears to a pair of disciples on the road to Emmaus. The gospel specifies that this is the same day, Easter Sunday. These 2 aren't part of the original 12 disciples. They're just 2 random followers of Jesus. They don't recognize him at first, and then their eyes are opened, and then Jesus disappears. So these 2 guys go to Jerusalem to tell the main group of disciples. the ones that are usually called the 12. But it's 11 now because Judas isn't with them anymore. The 11 say, "It's true. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Something is missing here because the disciples say that Jesus appeared to Simon, which is another name for Peter, but that doesn't occur anywhere in this story. The last time we saw Peter in this gospel, he was inspecting the tomb and wondering why it's empty. Apparently now he's seen Jesus and the author just didn't tell us about it. This isn't a contradiction. It's just a very confusing way to tell the story. In any case, in Luke, the disciples already know he has risen, and they seem to believe the men from Emmaus. That's contradicted in the long ending of Mark, where the men are not believed. Luke goes on to say that Jesus appeared to the whole group that same night. Here, Jesus emphasizes Jerusalem as the birthplace of the new movement, and he specifically instructs them not to leave the city. This directly contradicts the story in Matthew. In Matthew, an angel commands that the men will meet up with Jesus in Galilee, and they go. In Luke, there is no such command. They stay where they are. Jesus appears to them in Jerusalem, and he explicitly forbids them to leave. Moreover, Luke's gospel makes clear that this occurred on the very first night, Easter Sunday. So it's not as though they could have gone to Galilee before receiving the instruction to stay. Similar to Luke, the Gospel of John portrays the disciples as staying in Jerusalem. Just as in Luke, Jesus comes and visits the disciples on the first night. The main difference is that John says the apostle Thomas wasn't with the other disciples when Jesus appeared to them that first night. When they tell him about it, Thomas is skeptical, and he remains so until Jesus visits again a week later. There's a slight contradiction here, since Luke says Jesus appeared to all 11 disciples that first night, but John says Thomas wasn't there, so that Jesus would have appeared to 10 of them at most. I guess you could say that Luke uses the 11 as the name of that group, even when only 10 of them are present, but it's a little sloppy. After the Doubting Thomas episode, the Gospel of John seems to end. The last verses of chapter 20 certainly feel like an ending. Jesus performed many other signs, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. But that's followed by chapter 21, a sort of addendum or sequel that some scholars believe was added on later. John chapter 21 starts by saying that Jesus appeared to the disciples again, this time in Galilee. Obviously, this contradicts what it says in Luke about the disciples staying in Jerusalem. But besides that, it doesn't seem to fit with the previous chapter in John. Why are the disciples back in Galilee now? After seeing the resurrected Lord and receiving the Holy Spirit in chapter 20, they just went back to their hometown and resumed their old life as fishermen? Why would they do that? Wouldn't they be out in the streets spreading the gospel? John 21 really makes more sense as a first resurrection appearance. If they didn't see Jesus in Jerusalem, if they never got the message about the empty tomb, then it would make sense for them to leave the city and go back to fishing in Galilee. This feels like a story out of some other gospel, tacked on to the end of John for whatever reason. There are some interesting theories about this, but set that aside for now. The point is that Matthew puts the disciples in Galilee, Luke keeps them in Jerusalem, and John tries to do both. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The Gospel of Matthew and John 21 end with Jesus still on earth, talking to the disciples. In Matthew, he tells them, "And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." He may remain with them in a spiritual sense, but where will his physical body go? The Gospels of Matthew and John do not say. Luke tells us that he left them and was taken up into heaven. The same author tells the story again in Acts, but this time he adds 2 men dressed in white, presumably angels. So this doesn't technically contradict Matthew or John. They don't deny that Jesus ascended into heaven. They just don't mention it. But again, how do you not mention it? Remember, Matthew and John are the two Gospels that church tradition claims as eyewitnesses. If these two disciples witnessed Jesus floating up into the sky and hiding behind a cloud, wouldn't they include that in their testimony? This isn't just a detail. If true, this would be the one and only time in human history that a person flew into the sky without assistive technology. It's just not credible that these men witnessed it and didn't think it was important to write it down. So here's a summary of what we've found by looking at the four gospel accounts. It seems to me that the gospel writers give different or contradictory answers to each of the following questions. How many women went to the tomb and who were they? Was the stone removed before the women arrived, or did they witness an angel doing it? Was the tomb guarded or not? How many angels did the women see? Did an angel descend from heaven with a violent earthquake, or did the angels have the appearance of ordinary men? Did an angel appear outside the tomb, or after the women entered, or while Mary was outside looking in? Who inspected the tomb? Peter alone, or Peter and another disciple? Did the disciples inspect the tomb before or after Mary saw the angels? Did the women only witness angels, or did they see Jesus himself? Did an angel command the disciples to meet with Jesus in Galilee or not? Did the women go and bring the message to the disciples or not? If so, did the men believe them? Did the disciples believe the men who saw Jesus on the road to Emmaus, or didn't they? Did the men meet up with Jesus in Galilee, or did they stay in Jerusalem? If they saw him in Jerusalem, did they stay with him until he ascended, or did they go back to being fishermen in Galilee? Did all 11 disciples witness the resurrected Jesus on Easter Sunday, or did Thomas only see him a week later? And did the disciples see Jesus fly up into the clouds? Now, I don't doubt that someone who's sufficiently clever and imaginative could come up with a narrative that somehow resolves all of these questions. But in order to do it, you'd have to stretch the meaning of these passages beyond recognition. At some point, you would have to argue that the Gospels aren't saying what they seem to be saying. A neutral, unbiased reading of these Gospels shows that they are not telling the same story. They contradict. That does it for my analysis of the resurrection narratives. I encourage you to do your own analysis by looking at the gospel accounts and comparing the texts, just as I've done here. Leave a comment and let me know what you discover, or if you think I got something wrong. In my next video, I will consider some popular arguments for the resurrection, including the so-called minimal facts approach. Like and subscribe to be sure you don't miss it. And as always, thanks for watching.